Tonight, we descend into a world few cared to notice, but none could live without the smoke-filled, sweat-drenched, eternally bustling kitchens hidden beneath the grandeur of medieval castles. Before you settle in, take a moment to ease your body, relax your mind, and find a comfortable position. Let the gentle hum of history carry you as we wander quietly through time. It's just before dawn. You are not a nobleman, not a knight in shining armor, and certainly not a lady waiting to be serenaded. You are something far less noticed, but infinitely more essential. You are a castle cook in the high medieval period, and your day begins not with the gentle chirping of birds, but with the harsh rasp of iron being scraped against iron. Your bed, if it can be called that, is nothing more than a pile of rushes. In the back corner of the castle's servant quarters, the air around you smells of grease, stale beer, and the faint but permanent scent of boiled cabbage. You stir awake in darkness, your back aching from the uneven floor beneath you, and for a moment, you wonder if the sun will ever rise. But of course, the sun doesn't dictate your life, the kitchen bell does. You rise quickly, stretching limbs, made stiff by days of endless labor. There's no time to waste. By the time the roosters begin their familiar calls, the great hearth must already be burning, its flames fed by precious logs dragged in from the estate woods. The cold stones beneath your bare feet remind you it's winter, though in truth, it wouldn't matter. Kitchens are always hot, always loud, and always hungry. Your first task is fire. The hearth stands tall and wide in the great kitchen, blackened by generations of smoke and soot. You kneel before it, coaxing the embers to life with a practiced patience. Sparks crackle, smoke curls lazily upward, and soon a low, persistent glow fills the room. This fire will burn all day, fed without rest, much like you. The castle still slumbers above, its noble inhabitants tucked into feather beds, wrapped in layers of wool and linen. They will not stir for hours, but their needs are many, and you are expected to anticipate each one before they even blink awake. Next, you drag in the barrel-salted pork, dried fish, wheels of hard cheese coated in wax, and sacks of grains. Preservation is survival in these kitchens. The vast storerooms beneath the castle hold the riches of harvests long past, their shelves lined with dried herbs, pickled vegetables, and salted meats. Freshness is a fleeting visitor, reserved for festivals or the whims of visiting lords. By the time the first light creeps through the high arrow slits, the kitchen comes alive. You are not alone, of course. The castle's kitchen is a small kingdom of its own, ruled over by the head cook, the master of this noisy, steaming domain. His voice booms across the stones, barking orders before he's even fully dressed, directing the flow of the coming day. Beside you, other cooks shuffle in, their faces lined with years of smoke and strain. There is Agnes, who can bone a fish faster than most men can draw a sword, and young Tom, who joined just last spring and still burns his fingers more often than not. There's no time for conversation, only nods and grunts as the morning routine begins in earnest. Your hands move automatically, scrubbing root vegetables in cold water, checking the salted meats for mold, stirring cauldrons that haven't cooled since yesterday. The great bread ovens, built into the thick stone walls, are already warming. Soon, they will swallow dough by the dozen, spitting out crusty loaves to feed not just the nobles, but the entire household of servants, guards, and stable hands. Above, the lords and ladies dream of roasted peacocks and sweet pastries. Here in the underbelly of the castle, you dream only of silence and a brief moment to rest your feet. The day unfolds not in hours, but in bells, the ringing that echoes through the stone corridors, signaling meals, visits, and ceremonies. First comes the light meal for the servants. Porridge made from barley, a thin stew, if supplies allow, and perhaps a hard crust of bread, softened in warm milk. Your hands never stop. Even as you ladle porridge into cracked wooden bowls, you are already preparing for the next meal, the one that truly matters. The Lord's breakfast is no simple affair. He demands eggs, but they must be fresh, collected at dawn from the shivering hens in the castle yard. Bacon, sliced thick and fried, in rendered fat until crisp. Black pudding, simmered in its own peculiar way, and fresh bread with honey pilfered from the summer hives. Every bite must be perfect, for the wrath of a hungry lord is a storm no cook wishes to weather. By mid-morning your apron is already soiled, your arms speckled with burns, and your hair damp from the constant steam. The master cook strides through the kitchen, inspecting, correcting, and occasionally throwing a ladle when tempers flare. His word is law, his approval rare, but earning it is a badge of pride few ever forget. Just when you think you might pause, the bell tolls again, a low, ominous sound that reverberates through your bones. It's time to prepare the day's grand meal, the noon feast. Today, the Lord hosts visiting knights, men who measure status not by titles, but by how many courses are served, and how much meat graces their trencher. You hurry to the storerooms, selecting the finest cuts of pork and beef, the plumpest capons, and the rarest spices. Precious powders kept under lock and key, saffron cloves, cinnamon treasures from distant lands that turn ordinary dishes into declarations of wealth and power. Outside, the castle walls stand tall and imposing, but within these kitchens, time runs faster. Every moment is claimed by chopping, stirring, boiling, roasting. You help turn spits so large they could roast a whole deer. You monitor the bubbling cauldrons, their contents seasoned with care, as the scents fill the air, roasting meats, spiced sauces, fresh bread. Knights and lords above have no idea of the ballet unfolding below their polished floors. They will taste perfection, never knowing the toil and sweat that birthed it by midday. Your limbs protest every movement, but there's no stopping. The food must be presented, a procession of dishes so grand it seems obscene. You watch from the shadows as liveried servants parade the feast into the great hall, their steps precise, their platters gleaming. Applause fills the room, not for you, but for the illusion of plenty. Back in the kitchen, you scrape pans, clean doughs, coals, and finally, for a moment, steal a bite of cooled bread, your first real taste since waking. It is meager, but satisfying, and as you chew, you let your mind wander for just a moment, wondering what it might be like to sit above, to taste the fine pastries, to sip the imported wines. But the moment vanishes quickly, chased away by the sound of the master cook's orders. The day is far from over, and the evening meal looms large in the future. Outside, the winter winds howl against the castle walls, but here, inside the kitchen, the fires roar, and life continues in endless rhythm. The noblemen dream of battle and glory. You dream only of surviving another day without burning the stew. Above you, the castle's grand world turns, oblivious to the small kingdom beneath it, the world of pots and pans, of stews and sauces, of sweat, smoke, and survival. And as the afternoon shadows stretch longer across the stones, the bell prepares to toll again. Another meal awaits, another dance of flame and steel, and you, humble cook of the castle, will answer its call, just as you have done 1,000 times before, and as you will do again when the stars rise high over the silent towers, until the day ends not with applause, but with the quiet hiss of dying coals. And just as the embers settle, another chapter waits to unfold, where the kitchen's heart beats into the night through secret late meals, royal festivities, and whispered preparations for dawn's demands. But that is a tale for another quiet hour. The last of the great platters had vanished into the upper halls, carried by liveried boys who moved with mechanical grace, their expressions dulled by routine and the knowledge that their station would never rise. Beyond carrying food they would never taste. And you, cook servant, heartbeat of the kitchen, watched them go, the heavy doors closing behind their trailing sleeves, leaving behind only the low hum of crackling flames, and the echo of a feast you had crafted, but would never attend. Yet, your work was far from over. Beneath the noble festivities, the kitchens remained alive, pulsing with their own rhythm. Coals needed banking, pots demanded scrubbing, and the grease-streaked floor waited for its nightly sweep. These were the quiet hours, when the castle's grand halls roared with music and laughter. But down here, it was quieter, slower, almost secretive. The master cook barked fewer orders now, his booming voice worn down by the day's battles. Instead, he retreated to his small stool in the corner, sharpening knives with long, measured strokes, the metallic scrape mingling with the low pop of fat in the dying fires. His eyes, sharp as any blade, still watched every movement, but the fury had softened into tired vigilance. You scrubbed the massive iron cauldron, your hands raw from the lye soap and endless rinsing. Your shoulders ached, your knees throbbed, but there was a strange peace in the routine. Here, there were no pretenses, no fine words or polished armor, only simple, stubborn survival. In a small side alcove, Agnes began preparing the leftover stew into smaller portions. The stable boys would sneak down later, eyes wide with mischief, and she would hand them bowls under the table in exchange for news from the outside whispers of travelers arriving, merchants cheating the waits, or the latest scandal from the village inn. Food was never wasted here. Scraps became favors, broth became gossip. Above, in the great hall, a bard struck a stringed lute, his melody drifting faintly through the cracks in the stone ceiling. You couldn't make out the lyrics, but the rhythm was jaunty, meant to coax wind-drunk lords into laughter and forgetfulness. You wondered idly if they sang of knights and dragons, or of wrath, crusades where men perished for glory that only chroniclers would remember. A door creaked behind you, and young Tom entered, with 2 buckets of chilled water from the courtyard well. His cheeks were red from the winter air, and his grin crooked as ever. He set the buckets down with a grunt, shaking the numbness from his fingers. Cold enough to freeze the hairs off a boar, he muttered, flexing his hands. He smiled faintly, but there was little time for chatter. The meat hooks needed scrubbing, the bread troughs required scalding, and tomorrow's dough had to be prepared before your bones surrendered to exhaustion as you worked. The sounds from the upper levels shifted. Merriment turned to disorder, shouts blending with laughter, the telltale clatter of overturned goblets echoing faintly through the stone corridors. You exchanged a glance with Agnes, both of you too familiar with the signs. The feast was nearing, its drunken crescendo, and soon the summons would come. Sure enough, it arrived with hurried footsteps and a slammed door. A serving boy, breathless, delivered the inevitable command: "Sweetmeats for the Lord's table." He asks for almond pastries and spiced wine, quickly now. The master cook exhaled deeply, rising from his stool with a groan that came from both knees and soul. He motioned sharply, and the kitchen burst into a second life, bodies moving swiftly, fingers nimble, despite the ache of the long day. You dashed to the storerooms, retrieving the precious almonds and the jar of imported cinnamon that was guarded like a relic. Time pressed down upon you, but every step was known, every action rehearsed. The dough was mixed, rolled, pinched into neat little parcels. Honey was drizzled with the care of an alchemist pouring a potion. The spiced wine simmered, cloves and cardamom releasing their heady fragrance into the already dense kitchen air as you worked. A strange sensation washed over you, not pride, not joy, but something quieter, more enduring. It was the knowledge that, for a fleeting moment, the powerful above waited on you. Their pleasures rested in your weathered hands. They could command armies, dictate taxes, and don jeweled cloaks, but without you, their tables would be bare, their halls silent, their nights cold. The sweetmeats were arranged on silver platters, the wine poured into tall, ornate jugs. With one final glance of approval from the master cook, the serving boys swept them away, disappearing back into the grand world above, and like a tide receding, the kitchen fell into a brief, soothing stillness. You allowed yourself to sink onto a stool, pressing your palms to your knees, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath your fingertips. Your heart still pounded, your body still burned, but for the first time all day, you could hear the quiet. The fire hissed softly, a distant owl called from the castle battlements. Agnes hummed an old tune as she folded scraps of cloth for tomorrow's use. Even the master cook had softened, his sharp eyes half-lidded, his knife resting beside him rather than clenched within his fist. These were the stolen moments of peace, moments where the walls of stone felt less suffocating and more like shelter from a world that showed no mercy. Tom wandered back from the side storeroom, chewing on a pilfered crust of bread, his grin sheepish but unapologetic. You didn't scold him. In the kitchens, there were silent understandings. What was taken after hours was forgiven. As long as the morning still ran like clockwork, the minutes stretched on, and slowly, the fires were lowered. The cauldrons cooled, and the heavy doors were barred. Upstairs, The last of the noble laughter faded into the murky hush of the late hours. Somewhere in the highest tower, a chamberlain would douse candles. Somewhere in the drafty hallways, guards would settle into their long, cold vigil, and you, unseen and uncelebrated, retreated to your pallet in the servant quarters, limbs protesting every step, eyelids heavy as lead. You did not dream of glory or riches. You dreamt only of rest, and perhaps, if the gods were merciful, a morning where the bread did not burn. But as you lay beneath your thin blanket, the castle continued its endless life, above and below. You a world of pageantry built upon the backs of those who labored in silence. Before your eyes fully closed, a whisper reached your ears, the master cook's voice, gruff but laced with something almost resembling affection. Be ready at dawn. There's a hunt tomorrow. The Lord wants fresh game on his plate before the midday bell. And just like that, your brief reprieve vanished, replaced by the certainty of another day, where the fires would roar, the knives would fly, and your sweat would season every meal. Sleep came swiftly, but it was not deep. The castle's breath seemed to pulse through the very stones, keeping you tethered to the rhythm of its unending appetite. Tomorrow, the dawn would come too early. Tomorrow your hands would blister on you. Tomorrow you would wake to the call of the kitchen bell and answer it without complaint, because beneath the towers and banners, beneath the tapestries and triumphs, it was the kitchens that kept the castle alive. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when the embers flickered and the walls whispered of ancient secrets, you knew your place not in songs or chronicles, but in the bones of the very castle itself. And so, the last flame was dimmed, the final breath exhaled, and the kitchen's heart of stone and steel drifted into brief, fragile silence. But soon, in the hush before sunrise, the embers would stir again. The first crackle of flame, the first creak of iron, the first hurried footsteps, signaling that the eternal rhythm had begun once more. And in those shadowed corridors, you would rise again, cook, servant, silent architect of sustenance, ready to wage your quiet war against hunger and time. Yet, in that fleeting silence, you rested, you endured, and you waited for the next fire to burn. The castle slumbered, but deep within its ancient bones, the first spark of fire hissed quietly in the belly of the great kitchen hearth. Long before the roosters found their voice, and long before the gray light stretched its fingers across the sky, you awoke your body, reminding you that rest was only ever a brief visitor. The world was still dark, the halls above heavy with silence. Only the drip of melting frost from the high stone arches and the distant groan of shifting timber accompanied your slow rise from the coarse pallet. You stretched stiff limbs, feeling every knot and ache earned through the previous day's labor. And you listened not for voices or footsteps, but for the sound of the embers, waiting to be stirred back to life. The kitchen called. You were not alone in answering it. Agnes was already up, rubbing her palms together by the hearth, coaxing the reluctant coals to burn with practiced patience. Her breath fogged in the chill air, and in the dim glow, the lines on her face looked deeper, carved by countless mornings, just like this one. Tom stumbled in a few moments later, his youthful energy dampened by the relentless rhythm of castle life. You joined them, without words. The early hour was sacred, a time when speech seemed intrusive, when only the crackling of fire and the scrape of iron belonged. Together, you moved through the shadows of the kitchen, each step an echo of countless mornings before. The first task was always the fire. No meal could be prepared without the blaze standing sentinel over the kitchen. You fed it slivers of dry wood, listened to the pop and hiss as flames awakened, and soon the stones nearest the hearth began to warm, driving back the night's lingering chill as the fire grew bolder. So did the demands of the day. Today was no ordinary morning. There would be a hunt, and with it, a nobleman's expectation of returning to a table groaning beneath the weight of roasted game, thick sauces, and delicate pastries. Before the hunt began, the lords and their entourages would need a hearty meal: eggs, cold cuts, freshly baked bread, and steaming jugs of ale laced with honey and spice. Time was short, and expectations vast. You moved quickly, pulling heavy sacks of grain from the storeroom, measuring them with experienced eyes. You worked flour and water into dough, your palms pressing, folding, turning until the sticky mass transformed beneath your fingers into something supple, something alive. Tom set to stoking the ovens, his face reddened by the heat, while Agnes prepared the eggs, cracking them swiftly into great bronze pans that would soon dance over the flame. You heard the first stirrings from above the shuffle of boots, the distant clang of armor, the muffled murmur of men preparing for the day. The noble world began to wake, and with it, your pace quickened. In a corner of the kitchen, the master cook appeared like a looming shadow, rubbing his thick hands together before issuing commands with sharp, clipped words. 6 loaves by first. Bell, bacon crisp, eggs soft. The Lord's ale spiced, just so no skimping on the honey. The lad's portions hearty enough to silence complaints. Move. You moved, each motion born of instinct, of repetition, forged in fire and sweat. The loaves were shaped and left to rise, the bacon sliced thick from the salted slab, the eggs gently stirred over a careful flame. Jugs of ale were warmed, honey and cloves swirling within, until the bitter drink softened into something more indulgent. As you worked, the kitchen filled with its own quiet symphony, the hiss of fat, the low thrum of boiling pots, the rhythmic thud of the kneading trough, and the ever-present crackle of the central hearth. Outside, the first faint light of dawn colored the horizon, and within these stone walls, you were the unseen force that propelled the castle forward. The first bell rang out, deep and commanding, vibrating through the very stones beneath your feet. Moments later, the serving boys arrived, pale and half awake, their arms ready to ferry food to the upper halls. You passed them the platters steaming eggs, golden bread, slabs of crisp bacon, and pitchers of sweetened ale. They disappeared through the servants' stairwell, climbing into a world that rarely glanced downward. Into the depths where you stood. A brief pause fell over the kitchen. The first rush completed, you allowed yourself a swallow of cool water, wiping sweat from your brow with the corner of your sleeve. But rest was an illusion, one that never lingered. The master cook's voice snapped the quiet. Prepare for their return. They'll want more than a crust after chasing deer through the woods. The hunt was its own ritual, one you watched from a distance, through narrow kitchen windows that opened into the courtyard. The nobles gathered on their horses, dressed in fine furs and dyed wool, spears in hand, hounds straining at their leashes. They rode out in a flurry of hooves and laughter, disappearing beyond the gatehouse into the frost-touched woods beyond. You returned to your work. Game pies would be expected by midday. Roasted birds, fresh greens if any could be found in the barren winter garden's rich gravies, and delicate spiced treats to warm the belly after hours in the cold. You and Agnes cleaned the work table, fetching the earthen pie molds from the shelves, checking for cracks before lining them with fresh dough. Tom turned the spit, letting yesterday's stock reduce into a thick, flavorful base for the sauces. The master cook inspected the lighters, calculating which preserved fruits could be sacrificed for the meal, through the high slit windows. The gray morning gave way to a dull, wintry light, the courtyard growing quiet after the departure of the hunt. Only the stable boys remained, mucking out stalls, the occasional clop of a hoof breaking the silence. Within the kitchen, time blurred. The hours were not marked by sun or shadow, but by the changing smells that filled the air. First, the buttery warmth of rising dough, then the sharp scent of boiling onions and herbs, followed by the rich, meaty aroma of roasting joints. Each scent signaled a passage of time, a step closer to the next bell. The midday meal was a grander affair, meant to celebrate the triumphs of the hunt, even if little game was caught. You prepared the first-course soup, thickened with barley, and brightened with a few hearty leeks from the kitchen garden. The second course would be the game pie, filled with whatever was available: pigeon, rabbit, or if fortune smiled, a brace of partridge returned from the morning chase. The pie crusts were crimped and brushed with egg, their golden tops ready to crisp in the oven. Side dishes followed: cheese, nuts, preserved berries soaked in honey, and hot mulled wine to chase away the chill. As you worked, your hands never slowed, but your mind drifted to the world beyond these stone walls. You wondered what it might be like to ride out beneath the winter sun, to feel the wind bite at your cheeks from horseback, to taste the thrill of a hunt, even if the reward was simply returning home with a story. But such imaginings were fleeting. Your world was here by the hearth, with the knives. Among the smoke and the steel, the second bell tolled. And the serving boys returned, cheeks pink from their morning errands. The master cook directed them with a snap of his fingers, and once more, you passed over the fruits of your labor, carefully arranged, steaming and fragrant. As the platters vanished from view, you leaned briefly against the warm stones by the oven, feeling the deep, ancient heat seep into your weary bones. The kitchen fell into its briefest lull, the quiet between storms. Outside, a soft snow had begun to fall, its flakes swirling in the courtyard, dusting the heavy stones with white. You watched for a moment, savoring the fleeting beauty, before returning to the tasks that never waited. In the distance, faintly through the thick walls, the sounds of feasting began. Anew goblets raised, voices lifted in song, the bark of hounds restless by the hearths. And down here, beneath the grandeur, the fires continued to burn, the pots continued to boil, and your work remained endless. The afternoon stretched ahead, heavy with duties, yet to come preparations for the evening, clean up from the midday, feast, bread to be baked, and tomorrow's meats to be salted. But in that quiet moment, leaning into the glow of the fire, you allowed yourself a single deep breath, a small rebellion against the unrelenting rhythm of the castle. And as the snow fell gently against the gray sky, the hearth whispered back its reply, promised that the fires would always burn, the kitchens would always stir, and that you, silent architect of the feast, would always have a place within these ancient walls. The day wore on, and though the winter sun had long surrendered behind a curtain of thick gray clouds, the castle remained restless, its appetite insatiable, its demands unceasing. You stood once more beneath the blackened rafters of the great kitchen, sleeves damp from boiling pots, fingertips wrinkled from scalding water, and bones weary from a day that showed no mercy. The afternoon feast had ended, but its aftermath lingered like smoke on your skin. Wooden trenchers returned, scraped bare or smeared with forgotten sauces, jugs emptied of spiced wine, and greasy knives dulled by the reckless hunger of noblemen. You worked in silence, sleeves rolled high, wrists deep in soapy water that turned gray then black as the dishes passed through your care. Each scrape, each rinse, each stack of drying platters was a quiet declaration of your existence, hidden beneath the pageantry of a world that rarely knew your name. Agnes scrubbed beside you, her jaw set, her motions steady, every movement revealing the muscle built from years in the scullery. Tom carried great tubs of water to the outer drains, his breath visible in the frigid air that seeped through every crack in the ancient stones. The master cook prowled the edges of the kitchen like a wolf, inspecting, muttering, making notes in his head for the next round of tasks that would arrive before the moon had crossed the midnight sky. Above, in the warmth of the upper halls, lords recounted hunting tales, their exaggerated victories punctuated by the crash of goblets upon oak tables. Laughter rose, raucous and careless. But here in the belly of the castle, the only melody was the soft hiss of water and the dull clatter of wood and iron dot. As the last of the trenchers were cleaned and the greasy flagons scoured to a dull shine, you finally dared to glance toward the hearth. The great central fire, your eternal companion, burned low but steady, its embers glowing like a heartbeat in the quiet gloom. There was comfort in that flame, a reminder that while the lords fought wars and chased deer, it was you, cook, servant, keeper of the flame, who ensured the castle pulsed with life. Evening crept closer, not by the descent of the sun, which had hidden itself long before, but by the feel of the stones cooling beneath your feet, by the change in the air that whispered of night's arrival. The master cook called for the bread trough, and you obeyed, wiping your hands on a rough cloth before bringing it forward. Tomorrow's bread would not bake itself, and the rhythm of kneading was as necessary as breathing. You measured flour, by hand, eyes practiced, judging the weight without scale, the softness by touch alone. You mixed it with water, drawn from the icy well, with a pinch of salt, and the bubbling leaven saved from yesterday's batch. Your hands pressed and folded, the dough warm beneath your palms, stretching and yielding like something living, something growing. Agnes prepared the ovens, raking out the last of the ash, feeding fresh logs into the yawning mouths of brick and stone. Tom crushed dried herbs, readying the simple stew that would be your own supper. For there were no grand courses, waiting for the kitchen hands only what could be spared. Only what lingered after the upper halls had gorged themselves. With the loaves rising quietly near the hearth, you turned your attention to the next task, preserving what remained of the day's hunt. The master cook inspected the freshly delivered carcasses, pheasants, a single young boar, whose hide still steamed in the cold. His instructions were brief, his expectations high. Skin, salt, hang before the next bell. The small birds pluck and set aside for tomorrow's pie. You moved to the butchering block, your knife sharp and swift, slicing through flesh and sinew with mechanical precision, the scent of raw meat mingled with wood smoke, a harsh reminder of the cycle that sustained the castle's endless hunger. The boar was divided, its haunches rubbed with salt and packed into barrels that lined the cold cellar. The birds were plucked clean, their delicate forms lined upon trays, their bones destined for rich, hearty broth come morning. Time folded upon itself in the kitchen. Minutes became hours, and you felt the weight of the day settle deep within your muscles. Yet there was no rebellion, no refusal. This was life in unspoken agreement between stone and skin, between hunger and the hands that fed it. As the loaves baked, the scent of fresh bread curled through the kitchen, wrapping itself around you like a comforting shawl. You stood close to the ovens, letting their warmth seep into your bones, your eyelids fluttering against the creeping exhaustion. A quiet settled, broken only by the occasional crack of a log in the hearth and the soft bubbling of the stew pot. Dinner in the grand hall began with the third toll of the bell, and once more you prepared the final trays of the day. The evening meal was simpler, but still demanded care cheeses, arranged in precise wedges. Smoked fish laid atop wooden boards, honey-glazed roots glistening in the flickering light. You garnished each platter with sprigs of rosemary and thyme, not for flavor, but for the illusion of abundance that nobles so adored. The serving boys returned, their eyes shadowed but obedient, their arms eager to be rid of the kitchen's burdens. You passed them the final platters, your hands steady even as your body cried for rest. And then, at last, the castle seemed to sigh, settling into its nocturnal rhythm. The upper halls quieted, the laughter softened, and the footsteps grew fewer. In the kitchen, you swept the last of the flour into neat piles, scoured the benches with cold water, and banked the fires, leaving them to smolder beneath a thick blanket of ash that would preserve their life until dawn. The master cook dismissed you with a grunt, his approval measured in silence. Agnes wrapped the leftover bread in a linen cloth. Tom spooned stew into a shared bowl, and together you retreated to the servants' quarters, a narrow room lined with rough pallets and scratchy woolen blankets. You ate in quiet companionship, the stew plain but nourishing, the bread a gift of your own making. Tom spoke of a traveling merchant he had seen, unloading wares in the courtyard, man with silk so fine it shimmered like water, with spices that smelled of faraway lands. Agnes listened, her fingers working a needle through a torn hem, her expression distant, as though remembering younger days before the lines of toil carved her features. You listened too, but your mind drifted not to merchants, or silks, or spices, but to the waiting embers, to the next morning's dough, to the simple, quiet pride of keeping the castle alive without needing applause or acknowledgement. The bell tolled once more, softer now, signaling the castle's surrender to night. You lay upon your pallet, blanket tucked beneath your chin, eyes heavy with fatigue. The stones around you were cold, the wind howled beyond the high walls. But within these ancient bones, the hearth still whispered, and the kitchen still breathed. Your dreams, when they came, were simple, of warm bread, of crackling fires, of quiet mornings where the only demand was the next loaf to be kneaded, the next flame to be tended, and perhaps, in some distant world, of freedom beyond these walls. But for now, your place was here, in the unseen heart of the castle, where the embers burned steady, and the rhythm of life pulsed quietly through wood and stone. Tomorrow would come soon. The bell would toll again, the fire would need coaxing, the bread would need kneading, the lords would feast, and the castle would thrive because of you. And so you drifted into sleep, wrapped not in riches, but in purpose, warmed not by finery, but by the knowledge that, in a world built on grandeur, It was the quiet hands of the kitchen that held it all together. The castle had grown quiet, but quiet did not mean still. Above your resting head, nobles laughed in muffled bursts, the creak of the high rafters marking their late-night revels. Somewhere, boots scraped against flagstones, hounds shifted and whimpered in the kennels, and distant owls hooted softly into the blackness beyond the towering walls. Yet, beneath it all, the true heart of the fortress pulsed slow and steady in the kitchens, in the cellars, in the underbelly where the warmth of life never fully extinguished. Sleep came lightly, as it always did, because those who fed the castle could not afford the luxury of long rest. You stirred before the next bell, your body tuned to the rhythm of duty, to the unseen calls of hunger, thirst, and preparation that ruled every hour. The fire waited, the dough rested, the chores whispered in the stone. A single lantern guided your way through the narrow servants' passage, its flicker pushing back shadows that seemed older than the walls themselves. Your footsteps softened over well-worn stairs, your palm brushing ancient rock, fingers feeling the faint dents left by those who came before you, generations of cooks, bakers, and servants whose lives had fed the same ungrateful hunger. You reached the kitchen before the others, breathing in the lingering scent of ash and bread, of iron and smoke. The embers still glowed beneath their covering, dutiful and patient. With the skill of habit, you worked the iron poker, shifting the ash aside, teasing life back into flame. You fed it dry splinters, coaxing it gently until sparks danced, and once more, the kitchen breathed. Outside, the courtyard lay under a fresh sheet of snow, untouched, a rare peace that would last only until the next command echoed through the halls in the stillness. You listened not for voices this time, but for the ancient murmur of the castle itself. The groan of timber, the distant drip of water from the tower's eaves, the soft crackle of kindling. Here, in the deepest hours of the night, it felt as though the stones themselves sighed with you. By the time Agnes entered, brushing snow from her sleeves, the hearth was already alive. She nodded approvingly, wasting no words, moving instead to inspect the dough that had risen overnight. Tom followed shortly, carrying bundles of herbs tied in rough twine. Cheeks red from a brisk errand to the outer gardens, where stubborn winter greens clung defiantly to frozen soil. The master cook appeared soon after, his thick cloak trailing behind him, breath puffing like a forge. His arrival signaled the start of the day's quiet preparations, the unseen efforts that would bloom into banquets hours later, never attributed to the hands who made them. "More bread," he rumbled, glancing at the cold stores. "Stew, for the guards at first light, something warm to keep them sharp on patrol. Porridge with honey for the young squires. Keep it thick so they don't come complaining of hunger before midday. And there's talk of guests, arriving foreigners, with long titles and longer appetites. Begin preparations for a second feast, no matter what the Lord says. His generosity always grows with company." You absorbed the instructions without question. This was your world, a kingdom ruled, not by crowns, but by cauldrons, not by swords, but by spoons and ladles. The dough was portioned and shaped beneath your hands, each loaf marked with a simple slash, a small signature of the kitchen's unseen army. Agnes tended the stew, tossing in thick chunks of salted meat, a scattering of barley, and the few precious root vegetables left from the autumn harvest. Tom handled the morning ale, warming it gently, stirring in crushed herbs that soothed the belly and kept the mind alert during the bitter patrol hours as the minutes slipped by. The sky beyond the high narrow windows shifted from black to deep purple, a reluctant promise of dawn. Servants above began to stir, their footsteps echoing through the servant corridors, their chatter growing bolder with every passing moment. But here, beneath the halls of power, you worked in silence, every task performed in rhythm, every motion honed by repetition. You kneaded, stirred, seasoned, and tasted. You stoked the fires, scrubbed the benches, and prepared for a day that had yet to properly awaken by the time the first bell rang. The bread stood proud and golden upon the cooling racks, the stew bubbled softly, and the jugs of warmed ale lined the serving shelves, waiting for the first hungry soul to descend. The serving boys arrived in pairs, some still yawning, others rushing to beat the expectations placed upon them. You handed them the morning fare, securing lids with clean cloths, instructing them on which hall received which dish. They scattered like sparrows, disappearing through the narrow stairs, their absence leaving the kitchen hushed once more. But your day was far from done. The master cook motioned you toward the stores, his voice low and thoughtful. If there are guests, we must impress them. Open the spice chest. Use the good pepper, the imported cinnamon. Let the nobles taste wealth in every bite. Spices were gold in powdered form, hoarded carefully in heavy-lidded jars, their fragrances intoxicating and foreign. You moved with care, measuring the precious grains, mindful of waste, aware of the trust placed upon you. Prepare the pastries, he continued. Delicate hands for those crisp crusts, sweet filling. We'll serve them after the main course, alongside the imported fruits, and begin the roast. There's a fine capon in the cellar. Rub it well, slow roast, let the skin crisp. Agnes gathered the flour and honey, while you set to work on the pastry dough. Fingers deftly pressing and folding, creating thin sheets that crackled softly beneath your touch. Tom sharpened knives, the metal singing softly against the whetstone. Preparing to dress the capon for the roast above, life began to hum louder. Courtiers drifted from their chambers, boots scuffed along polished floors. Hounds barked in eager greeting, and the castle blinked fully awake. The scent of roasting meat soon enveloped the kitchen, mingling with the sweet promise of baking pastries, the comforting earthiness of bubbling stews. The castle would eat well today, and the whispers of satisfaction would fill the halls. But no voices would speak your name, as the morning bled into afternoon. The first messenger arrived, shivering and breathless, delivering word that the guests were near. The hunt would be brief today. The lord, eager to return and welcome his visitors with open arms and overflowing platters. Preparations shifted into high pace. But you moved smoothly, practiced. Trays were arranged, plates garnished with precision. Jugs were refilled, knives wiped to a gleaming shine. Agnes sampled the stew, adjusted the seasoning, nodded in approval. Tom basted the roasting capon, its skin golden and glistening beneath the high flames. By the time the hunting party returned, their boots stomping snow into the halls, their voices loud with fabricated victories, the feast was ready, spread in gleaming splendor upon the tables. You watched from the kitchen entrance as they devoured the offerings, teeth sinking into tender capon, hands tearing at warm bread, lips stained by dark berry pastries. They praised the Lord for his hospitality, toasted one another's health, and boasted of their own imagined heroics. Not one voice wondered who had shaped the loaves, who had spiced the stew, who had turned raw flesh into golden indulgence. But this was your way, the unseen guardian of the castle's comfort, the silent steward of satisfaction. Even as the feast dwindled and the nobles drifted toward rest, your work continued. Dishes cleared, benches scrubbed, bones sorted for broths. Remnants gathered for those lower still on the castle's hierarchy. The stable hands, the gatekeepers, the washerwomen. You carved and shared without complaint, the cycle of nourishment. Descending step by step, outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the world in quiet white, muffling the castle's ancient creaks. Night returned, but within these kitchens, the fires remained stubbornly alive, their embers glowing fiercely against the black. With the day's labors nearly complete, you found yourself once more by the hearth, resting for a brief moment, fingers stretched toward the warmth. The master cook stood nearby, inspecting his stores, plotting the next day's meals. Guests linger, he muttered. Tomorrow, we impress again. The good cheese, the last of the pickled pears. You nodded, Tomorrow would follow the same path. The embers would call you before the stars faded. The dough would rise beneath your hands. The kitchen would breathe and burn and hum. Yet, beneath the fatigue, beneath the unending cycle of labor, there was a strange peace. Here, in the warmth of the hearth, beneath the heavy stones, you were part of something ancient, something greater than the fleeting glories of those above. You were the keeper of the castle's pulse, the quiet force that held the world together when the banners flew and the feasts roared. As you finally stepped away from the kitchen, the bell tolling softly overhead, you felt the weight of the day settle into your bones. Your steps echoed through narrow halls, your lantern casting long shadows against crumbling walls. Tomorrow waited. The fire would call again. The dough would rise. The castle would feast, and you silent, unseen, steady would answer. Morning returned, cloaked in pale gray light, slipping through the thin cracks of the high kitchen windows. The castle outside stirred beneath its thick blanket of snow, a quiet world muffled by winter's heavy hand. Yet, below, the warmth of the hearth refused to bow to the cold, crackling steadily as you emerged from sleep. Joints stiff, but spirit steady. The familiar path led you downward, your lantern tracing gold along the ancient stone walls, before the first bell tolled. Before the high-born guests unfurled their silk banners and called for morning wine, you stood before the hearth, coaxing embers into life, preparing the heart of the castle for another endless day. Agnes joined soon. After her breath steaming in the chill, her thick shawl draped across weary shoulders. Her nod was brief, but knowing. Tom's boots followed, thudding softly, arms burdened with fresh-cut logs. The kitchen, dormant through the dark hours, awoke under your collective care. Fires growing tall and bright once more. The master cook descended late, his brow lined, his thoughts already a day ahead. Visitors stay 2 more nights, he said grimly. Tonight a feast to honor alliances. The hall will demand spectacle. Spectacle, a word that meant more than food. It meant illusion, abundance, decadence. You and your fellow kitchen hands knew the true magic of the castle was not in its battlements or banners, but in the steamy haze that rose from pots, in the gleaming skins of roasts, in the delicate sweetness of pastries crafted beneath calloused hands. Without hesitation, you fell into the rhythm, shoulders straightening, hands steadying. The work began as it always did, measuring flour into the trough, reviving the starter, kneading dough until your forearms burned and your knuckles protested. Loaves were lined up, brushed with eggs from the henhouse, sprinkled with grains, each awaiting their slow transformation by fire. Tom butchered without complaint, knife sliding through pork shoulders, separating rich fat from lean muscle, prepping cuts that would roast till golden under dripping fat. Agnes sorted through the last of the root vegetables, the good ones destined for honeyed roasts, the smaller, knotted ones bound for thick stews. The master cook opened the chest of spices, his gnarled fingers careful around the precious jars, treasures from distant markets that were rationed more strictly than coin itself. Cloves, nutmeg, saffron, and rich black pepper were measured sparingly, their scents alone enough to hint at luxury. There will be pies, the cook decided, layered with venison, apples, and winter herbs. The feast must impress. Your hands worked dough, while Agnes crafted fillings, her knives slicing apples thin, her mortar crushing juniper berries and sage into fragrant powder. The kitchen sang its soft song of preparation, steel tapping wood, water sloshing into basins, soft thuds of kneading, the low hiss of rising flame. The morning bell rang, and the serving boys arrived to ferry early sustenance to the squires and guards. You passed them warm porridge, thick with barley and sweetened with honey remnants, alongside dense oat bread that would keep the young men's bellies full until the midday meal. Then, swiftly, preparations escalated again. Boiling, cauldrons bubbled with broth rich enough to shine like amber. Iron hooks turned whole hairs above open flame. The great spit was erected near the main hearth, prepared for the centerpiece of the feast, a suckling pig stuffed with dried fruits, laced with fine herbs, rubbed in precious oils. The air grew, heavy with scents of roasting meats and melting sugars. Bread rose proud and round from the brick ovens, their crusts crisping as the fires roared. Pies stacked tall, their lattice tops brushed golden, juices bubbling at the edges, promising sweetness with each bite. And above you, banners unfurled in the great hall reds, gold's deep greens, the heraldry of noble houses. The castle above prepared itself in echo of your efforts below. Walls were swept, rushes scattered fresh upon the floors, goblets polished to mirror sheen. Hounds were bathed, squires dressed in new tunics. Even the Lord's hall resounded with the clatter of purpose. But only in the kitchen did the real battle rage, one against time, against hunger, against the unending demand for perfection. By midday, Your back ached and arms trembled. But the first course was complete bowls of steaming stew, thickened with barley. Platters of fresh cheese and pickled vegetables, arranged with the precision of an artist's hand. The master cook tasted every dish, his approval granted with nods more than words. Tom delivered salted fish to the lower guards, while Agnes folded cheese pastries for the nursemaids and women of the weaving quarters. You sliced bread, built towers of honey-glazed roots, and ensured the spiced wine simmered without catching flame. And soon, the signal came, the sound of hooves in the courtyard, the stamping of horses, the calling of stable boys. Guests had arrived. The castle shifted once again, the calm replaced by bustle. Voices raising above as foreign tongues mingled with local speech. New faces, new expectations, but the same hunger, the same reliance on the quiet, diligent hands of the kitchen. By the third bell, the great hall was a sea of bodies, rich fabrics swirling, laughter booming, goblets raised high. You remained at the kitchen threshold, the doorway framing your view of feasting lords and ambitious squires. They gorged themselves on meats you seasoned, bread you baked, stews you tended, pies you filled. They roared with satisfaction, praised the Lord's generosity, toasted to prosperity, never thinking of the sleepless hours that crafted their indulgence. And when the plates returned stripped bare, bones gleaming, you set to work again, scrubbing, scraping, stacking, reducing their grand feast to mere remnants. The cycle unbroken, the rhythm eternal. Only when the castle's torches burned low and the noble songs faded into the distant corridors did you find your way to the scullery bench. Settling upon the hard wood, muscles heavy with fatigue, Agnes nursed a simple bowl of broth. Tom shared the last crust of honey bread between you. You ate slowly, in the quiet that followed the storm, your satisfaction quiet, unspoken. No applause awaited you, no gold changed hands, but within the stones, your presence mattered. Your hands shaped survival. Tomorrow would rise with the same demands, the same roaring fires, the same endless cycles, and you would be their keeper of the kitchen, guardian of the hearth, uncelebrated architect of every feast above. The banners fluttered softly, and in the belly of the castle, the fire breathed steady and strong. The castle rested beneath heavy clouds, the sky above weighed down with the promise of more snow. The banners, so bold and proud during the revels, now drooped with quiet exhaustion. Above, the stone corridors lay still, only a few lingering footsteps stirring the air. Yet below, in the warm belly of the kitchen, life remained steady, anchored to duty. Before dawn's pale light touched the high towers, you were already awake, your body familiar with the silent summons of the hearth. You moved through the narrow passageways, your footsteps muffled by centuries of worn stone, and reached the kitchen where only the embers remained from the previous night's fire. With practiced ease, you uncovered them, shifting ash aside until the soft glow blinked back at you like tired eyes. Dry kindling cradled the flickers, feeding the flames until the small hearth once again danced with light. Pushing back the encroaching chill of winter, Agnes arrived without a word, her hands rough and skilled, already reaching for the flour sack. Tom followed, his cloak damp with melted frost, carrying fresh water drawn from the well. The surface skimmed with morning ice. The master cook appeared moments later, voice low but firm. "Another feast," he said, the weight of it pressing into every syllable. "Tonight they honor their agreements with more wine, more food, more noise." You nodded, knowing well the rhythm that followed. Each day might have its own reason, a hunt, a guest, an alliance, but the melody remained unchanged. The hearth must burn, the bread must rise, the meats must roast. The castle's hunger demanded constant care, and you answered without complaint. Bread dough rose beneath your fingertips, warm and pliant, while the hearth roared back to life. Agnes tended to the store of onions and leeks, setting aside the few still crisped from the last harvest. Tom prepared the great iron spit, checking its supports, ensuring it would hold the weight of the evening's centerpiece, 3 great birds, to be roasted and glazed, until their skin gleamed beneath the torches of the high hall. By first bell, the kitchen pulsed with activity. The chopping of roots echoed off stone walls, The hiss of boiling water mingled with the low hum of fire. Butter softened in clay pots, herbs were pounded to fragrant dust, and the distant sounds of stable boys and squires brought the castle into full wakefulness. You fetched the capons from the cellars, plump and freshly dressed, their flesh cold from the winter chill. Agnes handled the stuffing, her hands swift and sure, layering chestnuts, dried apples, wild garlic, and the last of the summer's preserved herbs. Tom basted them lightly, the oil dripping from the brush like liquid gold. The morning drifted into midday beneath your steady rhythm. Stews thickened with barley and chunks of salted pork simmered over open flame. Loaves browned in the ancient brick ovens, their crusts crackling with promise. Small pies, delicate and fragrant, were set aside for the high table-honeyed fruits encased in layers so thin they nearly melted beneath your fingers. Through it all, the master cook observed, his sharp eyes missing nothing. His rare nod of approval, a quiet reward for the morning's labor. The bell rang again, summoning servants to their midday duties, and you passed bowls of steaming food to the youngest squires, to the tired gatekeepers, to the weary messengers who trudged in from the frost-laden roads. Every mouth fed, every duty quietly fulfilled. But your hands did not rest. Preparations for the evening continued, growing in grandeur with each passing hour. The spit turned, the birds browning evenly, their skins crisping under the steady gaze of the fire. Root vegetables, coated in oil and sprinkled with rosemary, roasted in wide pans until their edges caramelized. Mulled wine simmered in great cauldrons, spiced with cloves, cinnamon, and slices of dried oranges, the scent drifting lazily through the warm kitchen air above. The castle stirred with life of another kind, footsteps rushing in anticipation of the evening's gathering, hounds barking in the courtyard, messengers darting back and forth beneath fluttering cloaks. The lord's voice rose in distant command, squires scrambled with polished armor, and stable boys readied horses for short afternoon rides. But in your realm of fire and food, time stretched longer, every minute filled with precise action. Bread was pulled fresh from the oven, pastries dusted with fine sugar, meats turned, basted again and again, until the fat sizzled and the skins crackled to perfection. The first hints of evening fell, the pale light outside fading to deep gray as snow, gathered thick upon the courtyard. Torches were lit in the high halls, their glow spilling from narrow windows, turning the white landscape to a warm amber, and the feast began. You watched, as you always did, from the threshold of the kitchen. Unseen but not unaware, lords gathered, cloaks heavy with embroidery, jewelry catching the flickering light. Ladies leaned toward one another, laughter flowing as freely as the wine. Foreign guests raised goblets high, their words thick with strange accents, their eyes hungry for spectacle. Plates laden with your work passed from hand to hand, the stews devoured, the bread torn apart, the capons carved expertly by the squire assigned to the high table. Roasted roots vanished beneath greedy fingers, pastries crumbled, mulled wine refilled over and over, and through it all, not one mention of you, not one nod to the kitchen below, that turned simple ingredients into royal indulgence. Yet you found no bitterness in the silence. The pride was in the craft, in the soft crackle of the perfect crust, in the satisfied sighs that drifted faintly through the open corridor. You knew the taste of your work lingered on every tongue, that your effort settled deeply in every guest's belly. The feast lingered late into the night, the hall filled with song and boasting. You returned to the back hearth, hands wrapping around a simple clay cup of weak ale, shared between you, Agnes, Tom, and the few others who kept the castle breathing through quiet hours. The master cook spoke little, sipping his own cup, his eyes distant, calculating the store's remaining. The meals ahead. You listened to the muffled music, the distant cheer, the occasional shout from drunken mouths. Above, the banners waved softly, the wind pressing against the thick stone walls. The embers glowed low once more, and you fed them carefully, knowing well their hunger, knowing the castle's demands would rise again with the next dawn. For now, in the quiet hush that lingered after feasting, you allowed yourself a moment of rest, a moment of peace within the world you helped sustain. Because tomorrow, the rhythm would begin again, steady, endless, unbroken, and you would be ready, as always, to answer. The wind howled beyond the stone walls, pressing itself against the castle like a restless spirit, its voice threading through the narrow arrow slits, sighing softly beneath the heavy wooden doors. The winter deepened, its grip tightening upon the land, but within the castle belly, the kitchen fires refused to yield. They burned steady and bright, as enduring as the unseen hands that fed them, before the first sliver of gray appeared upon the horizon. You were already awake, fingers numb as you layered thick wool across your chest, bracing for the cold corridor that awaited beyond the chamber door. Sleep left your limbs stiff, but your stride was steady, feet knowing every uneven stone, every bend of the ancient passageway, each step bringing you closer to the glow that had become your anchor. The kitchen hearth greeted you like an old companion. Softly beneath the blackened hood, its embers nestled in the ash like slumbering beasts. You crouched low, coaxing them awake with careful breath, with dry splinters that crackled before catching flame. With a slow nurturing rhythm passed down through countless winters, Agnes followed, her familiar shawl trailing behind her like a shadow, eyes sharp despite the early hour. Tom's footsteps were heavier, arms weighed down with fresh kindling in the early morning catch a pair of trout, their scales dull but their flesh fresh enough to glisten beneath the kitchen light. The master cook appeared as the flames kissed the base of the iron pots, his hands already sorting through the ledgers, eyes darting across the shelves to take stock of what remained. "Cold's biting harder," he muttered. "The feast stretches to 3 days, now they call it alliance, but it is indulgence they chase." You nodded in quiet understanding. The days grew longer beneath the banners of peace, but the work remained unchanged. Food must be found, meals must be crafted, the illusion of boundless plenty must be maintained. Even as the stores thinned and the fields lay dormant beneath a heavy blanket of snow, your hands fell into the rhythm without hesitation. The bread dough came first, coaxed to life with sour starter and warm water, kneaded until soft and smooth beneath your palms. Agnes handled the root vegetables, sorting the shriveled from the salvageable, cutting away rot with efficient flicks of her knife, revealing bright flesh beneath winter's toll. Tom salted the trout, splitting them cleanly, stuffing their bellies with the last of the preserved dill and a handful of sour berries salvaged from the stores. They would roast gently, basted with oil until their skins crisped, served to squires and gatekeepers before the midday bell tolled. The master cook's voice cut through the clatter. "Tonight, venison, stewed in wine, spiced richly. The Lord expects opulence beneath the banners." You listened, absorbing the silent instructions between words. Every meal was a performance, every bite a moment crafted to distract, to dazzle. You moved to the spice rack, fingers lingering over the precious remnants black pepper, traded at great cost, cloves sharp enough to command attention. Dried sage crumbled into a small ceramic jar. With measured care, you prepared the blends, crushing and grinding, transforming hard seeds into fragrant powder, coaxing their scents into the heavy kitchen air until it curled around your senses, chasing away the lingering frost that clung to your skin. Through the morning, the kitchen pulsed alive. Dough swelled in the troughs, fires hissed beneath simmering pots. The spit turned slowly as Tom mounted a leg of venison upon its iron prongs, the flesh glistening as it began its long journey toward tender perfection. Above, the castle stirred a world of polished armor, embroidered cloaks, muffled laughter, and sharp commands. The great hall was stripped and swept, new rushes scattered, high tables arranged with gleaming cups and fresh linens. Maids bustled between rooms, stable boys darted across the icy courtyard, the castle itself preparing to wear its finest mask. Yet here, in the belly of the stone, there was no mask, no pretense, only the honest labor of those who made such celebrations possible. Before the second bell, you carried bread to the outer courtyard. Thick crusted loaves, paired with steaming bowls of stew. Squires and men-at-arms huddled near the small hearths, their faces flushed from the cold, their gratitude unspoken, but visible in the way they ate, with focused hunger returning. Your sleeves damp from melted snow, you joined Agnes in shaping small pastries, delicate rounds filled with sharp cheese, flecked with wintertime. They would be served to visiting clerics, those who preferred modest portions but judged with sharp eyes and sharper tongues. By midday, the pace quickened. The venison simmered beneath a thick lid, its juices blending with aged wine and fragrant spice. The bread rolled from the ovens, golden and crackling. The fish, crisped and gleaming, vanished toward the lower quarters, ensuring no belly among. The laboring class went empty, and above, the scent drifted upward, winding through the stone stairwells, reaching the halls of power where lords laughed and boasted of alliances, where visiting nobles raised their goblets in loud toasts, never once wondering of the quiet world that sustained their grandeur as evening neared. The kitchen grew thick, with the sweet perfume of stewed fruit spears, simmered in honey and cloves. Apples baked until their skins burst, sprinkled with the last of the crushed walnuts. The finest remnants of autumn's harvest turned into jewels, upon plain clay plates. You worked without pause, your fingers steady, even as muscles strained, as heat wrapped around you like an iron cloak. You basted the venison once more, ensuring its flesh gleamed beneath the torchlight. You brushed the bread with oil until it shone. You listened for the master cook's rare nods, guiding the rhythm of the evening. By nightfall, the great hall was alive, the laughter loud enough to tremble the wooden beams. You watched from the threshold, unseen yet observant, the fruits of your labor devoured beneath towering banners and polished chandeliers. You watched as the Lord toasted new friends, as visiting dignitaries reveled in their gluttony, as squires passed plates back and forth, their arms tired but their spirits high. And you stayed in the quiet glow of the kitchen, surrounded by the last embers, the smell of fresh bread and roasting meat lingering in the air, the knowledge of your purpose settling deep within your bones. When the last platters were carried back, stripped of all but bone, when the final pot was scrubbed and the final crumb swept away, you sat upon the worn bench with your quiet companions, Agnes sipping weak ale, Tom sharing a heel of bread, the master cook staring thoughtfully at the embers. Outside, the snow continued to fall, cloaking the world in silence, but within, your world remained warm, steady, unshaken. Another day had been conquered beneath the shadow of stone, beneath the banners of false celebration, and tomorrow you would rise again. Uncelebrated, but essential, unseen, but enduring. The castle would demand, and you would answer, and the fire, your constant companion, would burn ever on. The castle stood unchanged, its silhouette carved against a winter sky that stretched wide and pale, touched faintly by distant morning light. The snow had hardened into a crust of ice, sparkling beneath the heavy walls, blanketing the world beyond the ramparts in undisturbed silence. Yet within those walls, the breath of life persisted, steady, quiet, and enduring beneath the stones worn smooth by generations of footsteps, before dawn properly stirred. You were awake for the final time in this season's long chain of endless days. Fingers brushed against cold stone as you dressed, your motions unhurried, steady in the knowledge of the rhythm that had carried you thus far. The path to the kitchen was known by heart, each creaking floorboard and rounded corner offering the same comfort as a familiar friend. The kitchen greeted you, as always, with the low warmth of banked embers, the gentle hush of the room before. It awoke fully. You knelt before the hearth, gathering the embers together, coaxing the smallest flames from their hidden depths, drawing light where shadows reigned. Agnes arrived moments later, her usual quiet nod greeting you, her hands already occupied with a bundle of cloth that carried the day's roots. Tom appeared after, his boots carrying the trace of morning frost, arms burdened with a brace of rabbits, their fur stiff with cold, their usefulness destined for the final feast. The master cook's voice broke the hush, no longer sharp but low, worn with the weight of the long winter. "Tonight, the last of it," he said, his gaze not on the ledgers but on the flickering hearth, eyes reflecting the fire's quiet glow. "The last feast before the guests return to their far lands, before the Lord seals his promises with silence rather than song." And you listened, your heart steady in your chest, for the rhythm had reached its gentle final verse. The preparations were known, the tasks familiar, yet beneath it all there lingered a softness, an ending threaded within the day's work. Your hands were gentle as they kneaded the last batch of dough, your fingers knowing the perfect weight of flour and water, of warmth and care. The scent of rising bread curled through the air, carrying memories of 100 mornings, of countless unseen labors turned into sustenance. Agnes worked beside you, her knife dancing effortlessly through withered roots, salvaging what remained beneath the frostbitten skins. Tom's blade was precise as he dressed the rabbits, each cut clean, each piece prepared with reverence for the meal it would become by the first bell. The kitchen had settled into its final performance. The bread rested beneath cloth, the pots simmered low, the hearth crackled, steady and strong. The last preserved sausages were fetched from the cellar, their casings brittle but their flavor rich. A small pot of wine, spiced and heavy, stood, warming at the edge of the fire, its sweet perfume filling the room with the comfort of indulgence. Above, the castle's rhythm shifted too. The great hall was swept more thoroughly, the rushes freshened, the silver polished until it caught the light of every flickering torch. Banners were straightened, tapestries brushed, the illusion of endless prosperity woven once more for the night's celebration. But you felt it, beneath the clamor and motion, the quiet acknowledgement of the season's close, of a chapter folding gently into history. The midday meal passed quietly, bowls of stew ladled out with quiet satisfaction, small portions of roasted fish shared among the lesser ranks. There were smiles where before there had been only weariness. Conversations lingered longer. The knowledge of a final feast softening voices worn hoarse by weeks of service. The afternoon thickened with preparation. The rabbits were stewed in wine with crushed juniper berries and wild thyme. The sausages were seared and folded into pastries, their edges pinched tight by your practiced fingers, the bread baked golden, its crust singing beneath your knuckles as you tapped for readiness. Small pies filled with preserved fruit were brushed with the last of the honey, their tops decorated simply, a quiet beauty rather than the grandeur demanded by foreign guests. The final jug of cream was carefully divided, reserved for the high table's sweet custards. The last indulgence before the long quiet of winter deepened further. By the time the sun lowered behind the snow-laden hills, the kitchen had completed its final symphony. Plates stood ready, bowls filled and gleaming, bread stacked high, meats glistening in their juices. The master cook's shoulders eased, his sternness softened into something resembling quiet pride. Above. The feast began, and for the final time, you stood by the doorway, watching as the hall filled with life one last time. The laughter rose, the goblets clinked. The distant sound of string instruments drifted across the stones. You watched as lords and ladies indulged, their faces flushed with wine and satisfaction, their voices louder than before, their movements more relaxed, the urgency of alliances tempered by the comfort of full bellies and promised peace. You smiled, just faintly, as the steward raised his goblet, thanking the household, the unseen hands, the tireless workers who had ensured a season of wealth and comfort. It was a rare acknowledgement, simple words drowned beneath the chorus of louder toasts, but you heard it, and it settled warm against your ribs. When the final platters returned, when the last morsel was devoured, you joined Agnes and Tom near the hearth, the master cook silent beside you, his hand resting lightly upon the worn ledger that would close until the thaw returned. The castle quieted slowly, the footsteps less hurried, the voices softer, the halls no longer pressed beneath the demands of festivity. Outside, the snow fell in delicate flakes, gentle, unhurried, covering the paths that would lie empty for many weeks. You washed the last bowl, dried the final spoon, and placed them carefully upon their shelf. The bread oven cooled, the pots scrubbed clean, the hearth banked for its quiet rest, ready to smolder softly until dawn returned, and then you stood. Your back straight despite the ache, your breath steady despite the long hours. You looked upon the kitchen not with weariness, but with the quiet satisfaction of a duty fulfilled, of a season's demands met with unwavering care. The master cook nodded to you, a silent farewell to the rhythm you had shared through the coldest days. Agnes pressed her hand to your shoulder briefly, a rare sign of companionship, and Tom grinned. His usual jest quietened into something softer. As you stepped from the kitchen, Your path took you upward for the first time in many moons through the winding stairwell into the outer courtyard, where the snow lay thick, untouched, glistening beneath a sky heavy with stars. You breathed deeply, the air crisp and sharp, filling your lungs with the silence you had labored to protect. The castle would slumber now, its belly full, its guests gone, its heart softened by the memory of warmth and feasting. The fires would burn lower, the bells would toll less often, and the kitchen would rest alongside you. And as you turned your face to the sky, you allowed yourself a rare moment of stillness, not just the end of toil, but the quiet triumph of having endured, having sustained a world that never once thanked you properly, but could not have survived without you. In the hush of winter, beneath the ancient stones, beneath the weight of banners and whispered promises, you stood strong, steady, and ready for the seasons to turn again. The final ember within the hearth sighed its last glow, and in the silence that followed, there was peace.